So a new wrinkle in Transformers' history has finally been unearthed, and more so, a mystery has finally been solved. A old prototype that we knew from Generation 2 for many years finally had his official name revealed. And I'm going to go into that because usually when we have stuff like that, it's like, oh, okay, that's the name of that prototype. That's pretty cool. But there's a little more to it because of the name of this character, that being Blackout. And I love diving into the naming conventions of characters and how they evolve throughout the years, and sometimes how we associate names with certain characters permanently, despite the fact that they had other iterations beforehand. Best example of that probably would be like the likes of, say, Bulkhead or Barricade. You know, Barricade was one of those individuals that, while he was a Micromaster for many years and then was later on an Energon character, it wasn't until that 2007 movie that when we think of the name Barricade and we hear the name Barricade, we think of a Decepticon police car. And it's literally what it's been since then. And it's the same thing with Bulkhead. Yes, there was back in the day an Energon character named Bulkhead that literally, when you think about it, was just on just as many episodes of Energon as it was, let's say, animated. But the Bulkhead character, when we think and hear the name Bulkhead, how could we not think about the animated character of Bulkhead, the big, round animated character, and how he influenced everything afterwards, even with a Transformers Prime character. So it's always interesting to see that evolution. There's so many other examples I could think of on the fly. I mean, even, during the Armada era, someone like Red Alert, how when it came around, that kind of changed how we thought of Red Alert for the longest time before we went back to the Generation 1 look. And now when we think Red Alert, we think of the Generation 1 character. But let's go to Blackout here, and let's go to his early history, and then move up to this interesting mystery that was finally revealed with Generation 2. Now, Blackout in 1990 was a trademark done by Hasbro and was used for the 1990 Micromaster Combiner playset, which he had a combiner with another member named Space Shot. They combined to this big tank, and they had this big tank playset, and it was what it was, the anti-aircraft base for the Decepticons. He was the front end of this Micromaster Combiner, and it was the front end of a jet. So that kind of began the beginning of his aerial connection as a character named Blackout. The one thing that I could note about this from messing with this toy throughout these years was he was one of the first Micromasters and one of the few Micromasters that actually had left to right neck articulation, which most Micromasters, you had feet and you got arms and legs, and that was pretty much it, and that was mostly due to transformation. In the case of Blackout here, also kind of due to transformation, mind you, he had left to right neck articulation, so he could look left and right, which was rare for a Micromaster back in 1990. And that trademark expired and was not used for many, many, many years. And then in 2002, Hasbro filed for the trademark for Blackout again, but it was going to be used for both the Transformers and the G.I. Joe brand. And I'll get into the G.I. Joe part afterwards. So in 2002, Armada had a character named Blackout, which was the Minicon that was paired with his bulk partner of Demolishor. So the big, Decepticon Demolishor character from Armada. And he was one of the few early examples of a Minicon that kind of looked like his bulk partner, like in terms of alt mode, and also had those multi-use purposes that were kind of lost in the later waves of Minicons. Back in the early first wave of Armada, a lot of Minicons had like multiple uses on their deluxe Transformers, like could hold weapons, could sit in different places. As it kind of evolved later on, it was kind of like plug it in here, something flips up, that's usually it. So he was one of the early examples of that. And of course, this little Blackout Minicon would get repainted for Demolishor's Power Links version. When Demolishor got a BTR built to rule, we'll call it the Hasbro Lego toy before Creo, he had a BTR version. And then, of course, when they did a repaint the Night Attack, he had a version of that. And oddly enough, as a little side note, when Demolishor was moved to the Cybertron toy line after Energon, because of the line-wide gimmick where they had cyber keys instead of Minicons, Blackout didn't get a Minicon release there. Instead, Demolishor got a cyber key instead. So that's just a little side note. Now, Energon's kind of weird because when you go into Energon, Demolishor gets his Energon repaint, which was a KB Toys exclusive, and had Blackout as a minicon there. And Blackout was present in the Energon line. But oddly enough, to add confusion to it, in the Energon line, there was other Blackout characters, not to confuse everybody. Now, it kind of started with the sense that there was a early dub mistake, which was when Energon was being dubbed, the characters of the Shadowhawks, which were these like blue repaints of Dive Bomb, the Terracon Dive Bombs in Energon, in one episode they were called Blackout. Now, that was probably an early dub error. I can't confirm that, but, you know, both Armada and Energon, and even a little bit Cybertron, because of the rushed nature of those dubs, there's a lot of sometimes characters are called the wrong names, and or, you know, little things here and there from the script are not done correctly. But so that was one character named Blackout. But the bigger confusion that adds to it is that there was a combiner piece for Bruticus Maximus called Blackout, which this purple helicopter was called Blackout, even though in the Japanese version of Bruticus Maximus stuck with his G1 counterparts naming conventions. So you had, you know, Vortex or Votor, as he was called in Japan. You know, you had Swindle and all that. And in the case of what was Blackout, you had a character named Blastoff, based off of the Generation 1 counterpart, but when brought over to America, he was called Blackout. Now, granted, you know, the rest of Bruticus Maximus also had all kinds of weird trademarks. There was a character called Kickback as one of the limbs. There was a character called Blight, which was a new trademark at the time. So, and even, look, the main leader of all of this was called Barricade instead of, you know, Onslaught. So, and even that Barricade trademark would be tied to Blackout in the future in a lot of different ways when we think about it. Kind of funny. But this was the first time we had Blackout as a Decepticon helicopter, and this would be tied to that character deeply in the future. And lo and behold, when we get to 2007, there would be a Decepticon helicopter named Blackout, and that movie would change the way we depict that name. And of course, you know, as I was going to say before, in 2003, there was a G.I. Joe character named Blackout. He kind of had a crew cut, and then would get a 2013 Real American Hero anniversary toy to kind of keep that trademark fresh in Hasbro's inventory if they needed to use it for Transformers or otherwise. Now, what is the story with this mystery? So, for many, many, many years, there was this black Decepticon G2 Starscream molded jet that just had Black Death written on the nose cone. And it was one of the many unreleased, you know, hand-painted mock-ups of stuff that was going to be used in the G2 line. An example of that was, if you look at the Transformers Vault book, there was a Sandstorm character, which was the same thing. For years, people just called it Desert Ramjet, because it was the Ramjet mold, the G2 Ramjet mold, but it was done in, like, you know, those tan desert colors. And then it ended up being called Sandstorm because we found some old mock-up, you know, box art images with their assortment number and everything. And you might go, oh, Sandstorm, so it was supposed to be an Autobot? Nah, it was probably going to be a Decepticon. G2 was weird like that. They had a lot of, like, Autobot or Decepticon names thrown around. I mean, if you kind of look like later G2, we had a Smokescreen character that was a Decepticon that was a jet. So it kind of has weird stuff like that. So we had this black Starscream jet, and for years it was like, oh, it's Black Death Starscream was kind of the nickname for it. Finally, it's been unearthed that we find, just like with the Sandstorm, this box art mock-up with the assortment number, we finally get to see the name of the character, and it's called Blackout. So it's really interesting that we had a MicroMaster half-jet Decepticon in 1990, and then 2-3 years later, assuming when this would have came out, we ended up getting a black jet Decepticon named Blackout. And I guess the name just kind of works with it perfectly. I don't think if it would have had Black Death on the nose, oh, that's pretty metal if that would have happened. But he looks really cool, and it's an interesting twist considering how many black repaints we have today of that Starscream mold, like full black repaints, whether it be dead Starscream or whatever. Now that could kind of almost be repurposed into the G2 blackouts that we have in the G1 continuity. But it unearths at least a little bit of that mystery, and now we kind of see how they wanted to use that trademark. They probably didn't file for it, so that's why it didn't happen ultimately in the end. And then we wouldn't see that trademark resurface until 2002 with the Energon character. And what's also interesting to note is a lot of these box art mock-ups, they have the assortment numbers, and every single one of them had kind of different assortment numbers. So I think that it almost felt like every wave there was going to be a jet released to kind of just freshen up each wave and have some kind of jet. But again, this is all just assumption. We'd have to talk to the old guys of the Hasbro Guard from the early 90s. But this is very fascinating stuff, and it unearths yet another mystery of a character that we kind of just had a fan name for years in Black Death Starscream, and now we know that all black jet repaint was indeed Blackout and part of the lineage of that character that we know today. So very fascinating. I'm going to post obviously some images of the original mock-up and the art and everything, and you could just gawk at it and enjoy. And a lot of this information could also be found obviously today now on the Transformer Wiki. They did a post about it on Twitter, I want to say 3 or 4 days ago, which also kind of, documented some of the other unreleased G2 characters and stuff, whether it be Watermalon Mirage, as I like to call it, Yummy Orange Jazz, and the Yellow Sideswipe, and so many others. G2 was just a cornucopia of beautiful 90s colors, something Will Smith would have proudly worn on Fresh Prince of Bel-Air back in the day. But yeah, check this out. This is awesome, and it's just beautiful to now have another mystery of Transformers history finally solved.